For my next tutorial, I want to show you just some real basics here. I'm going to go in, I'm going to make a snowman. I don't want you to necessarily make exactly what I make. I want you to make your own. I'm going to show you the basics of how to get started, though. All right, so I'm here in my Autodesk 3ds Max, customize unit setup, making sure my system unit setup, 1 unit equals 1 centimeter. Okay. So I'm going to come over here to create geometry. Make sure that you take your edge of your viewport and drag it over until you get 2 columns here. So now I'm going to come click on sphere. I'm going to find keyboard entry and click on it to expand that rollout. And for radius, I'm going to enter a value of 100 and hit create. Now if I right click, that takes me out of creation mode. Hit Z, it's going to zoom out on this guy. Here's my sphere. Now I could go ahead and make another sphere and just click and drag. I don't use keyboard entry again because I wanted to make sure that I was starting with a sphere that was 1 meter in radius. That gives me kind of an anchor for everything else. Now I want to take the sphere and I want to stack them on top of the other one. So I'm going to come up here to move, right, which is M on your keyboard. I'm just going to move him over so that he's sitting kind of centered. And then here in the front, I'm going to raise him up. Now you could do that work here in the perspective view, but I wanted to show you that working with your 2-dimensional views works very well. Right? Sometimes makes it a little bit easier. I'm going to click on the sphere, and now I'm going to right click and say clone. And I'm going to clone this as an instance and say OK. And so now I have another exact copy. All right. There's another version exactly like this sphere. If I come here into modify, and if I change his radius, notice how both of their radiuses change. Right, that's because they're instances of each other. If I wanted to make this guy unique, so he doesn't make exactly the same changes as the other one, I would click here, that's make unique, and then I could drag those. And now he's no longer an instance. All right. So that gives me a good starting point for my snow person. Now I'm going to make some coal for the eyes. So I'm going to come over here. And now I'm going to do this in the front. So if I try and make my eyes over here in perspective, notice how if I try and make them, they don't make it directly on the surface. It makes them on the perspective plane. And so that sphere is all the way over there. So I'm just going to delete that. Instead, I'm going to make it here in the front. I'm going to click and drag. Right click to get out of that, and then kind of zoom out here on the left and just drag this over. So now I can see here in the front, that's where he starts to kind of pop through. If I orbit this guy around, I can see the front. There we go. Now there is another tool here. We've talked about move, rotate, and scale. This guy's select and place. When I click on him, it actually places this object on the surface, right? You can see in the other viewports how that's working. So let's go in, let's make this guy, I'm going to hit F4 or click here and say edged faces because I want to see how much geometry makes them up. I'm going to reduce the number of segments because I want this to be a little bit more edgy, kind of like a piece of coal. There we go. So now I got one. And if I want, I could come over here and click to make this like a darker color. There we go. Now I could right click and say clone. I'm going to clone this as an instance, and I can move him over. Now I get another one. Right click and clone as an instance. I'll move him around, and maybe this one I'm going to make him unique and just make him a little bit smaller. And then another option instead of right clicking and hitting clone is holding shift. If you shift and drag, that brings up the clone option. So I could set that to instance and say OK. That's just holding shift and dragging. Allows you to select multiples. Or, I'm sorry, shift in and clone. Shift in any of the any of these 4 transforms, clones whatever you currently have selected. So if you wanted to select multiples, you can click and drag, and that grabs everything in that viewport. You could also hold the control key to select multiples and hold alt to deselect, because maybe you'll want to come in here I'm going to switch to move. Right click to make this viewport active, and then maybe I want to have these guys kind of embedded in the head just a little bit further. All right. There we go. Kind of got those going. Maybe I'll make a cone. So let's just click and drag, release, and then just make that small. Again, it's one of those things where you don't necessarily need to make the perfect one as you're initially making it, because you're going to move it into position later. Like I can use my select in place now to make sure he's sitting right on there. And then if I want to adjust its size, let's orbit around here. You can always go in and make it thinner, smaller, however you want to handle it. All right. There we go. Control R to orbit. I'm making myself a fun little snow person here. All right. So we got our kind of our basics going. The next thing, all right, maybe I'll go ahead and make him just an arm. So let's make a cylinder. And we'll do the same thing. We'll do select in place, which is already on. Just oops. Move that over here. Let's zoom in a little bit. Control R to orbit. Kind of move that over. So the default for cylinders is pretty high. It's a default of 18. I'm going to change that to 6, right? And it still looks, I'm going to do maximize viewport. At 6 sides, you can still see it very clearly as a cylinder. Now, one thing you'll notice here, when I am in select in place, it says local next to it, and use pivot point center. So its origin is down here at the base. You see how kind of the X, Y, and Z are going in these directions. As soon as I switch to move, it just does this, same like straight up and down in every viewport. I'm going to hit G in all these so it's a little bit easier to see. Control Shift Z zooms out in every viewport. All right, there we go. So I can change where this pivot sits. Like if I click and hold here, that allows me to change to pivot center. So now it's on the center of whatever I select. I could also change the reference coordinate system if I switch that to local. Now it matches sort of, if you remember, select in place, how it was, it's still kind of doing the center. I need to change that back to pivot. That's where I created it. I made that base, and then I gave it its height. So that's why that's sitting there. Now, with move, I could change that so that in move it does the same thing off of that point. So say, for example, I wanted to clone this. I'm going to right-click, say clone as an instance, and say OK. And now maybe I'll move this guy out, and I'll switch to rotate, which I'm going to set that to local as well, and have it on pivot point center. And now I can kind of move it. I'm going to leave it with a little bit of a gap there. There we go. And do the same thing. In this case, I'm going to hold shift and drag it up. I'm going to make him unique now. Make him a little bit thinner and a little bit shorter. And I'm going to come up here and drag it along Z as an instance. Going to rotate, and I want to rotate him down a little bit. Hold shift and drag him out. Say OK. Rotate him again. Now I'm kind of making fingers. All right. So I could grab all those and say group, call it finger 1. So now that whole thing is selected as a finger. So I can come over here and hold shift and drag it. It's going to clone all of those as an instance. I'm going to do that 2 times. I'm just going to move it so that those fingers are kind of sitting near the end of this guy. Maybe I'll maneuver them around at this point. Maybe I'll switch it just to regular view to make it a little bit easier for maneuvering. Same with rotate. Switch it back to view. There we go. So now I'll make it look like his fingers are kind of slowly moving around there. right? We can even grab those and clone it again as an instance. Rotate it. Let's sort of move it back a little bit. And if I want to, I can come in here and say group. And let's make this unique. Do I want to make selected items unique with respect to each other? I'm going to say no, because I want to make them unique. I want to separate them from these guys, but these guys will all be their own kind of set of instanced objects. So I'm going to select this guy at the end, and all these guys down here. All right, notice I could go ahead and I could make them a little bit thicker if I wanted, because they're both instances of each other. And so I can say group, and I can close that group up. There we go. So I can grab this arm and grab all the pieces and make a group of that. Arm. There we go. Oops, let's make this a front view again. And now I could go through and say tools. No, I'm sorry, edit, clone. I want to clone this as a copy. I'm going to put a different modifier on this. I'm actually going to use mirror. It's going to mirror on the x-axis. So now I can just drag that over to the side. And now I've mirrored that arm over. So now I have the basic start of a snowman. Snowman, snow person. I can come in here, and from my top view, if I zoom out, I can make a little plane out there in the world. And now he's sitting on the snow. So that's kind of the basics for going in and starting to work what we're talking about here. Excuse me. This is what's called primitive modeling. We're just working with the basic objects.